So let's speak about the Super 7. We'll talk about it just structurally and then the inside of it. So it's divided into three sections, Alpha, Omega, and Infinity. It also has Stephen's titles, and it's divided into 27 chapters, 9 chapters per section, and all Stephen's titles.
Wallace Stevens.
Wallace Stevens titles, yes. They play off in the same way that Wallace Stevens titles usually do with his poems. So in that sense, they're taking what Wallace Stevens did and mirroring it. But they also have different effects too, in adding some grandiosity into otherwise something you wouldn't naturally connect into it. Same thing with that the subtitles of these three sections do with Alpha, Omega, and Infinity, where like the whole of existence is compacted in this one spy's life. You said this, Elias Walker. It's interesting how different the techniques are in between these two books. Outside of the fact that it's named the same person, they really have very little to do with each other outside of some things that you can view into. Speak about that, some of the diversity of the construction of these books, and why trilogies are often so linear and straightforward, getting out of the A to B to C narratives.
Well, as far as why trilogies or any kind of sequence, they generally are recapitulative, is that's what audiences like. Audiences don't like to be challenged. And you can go back to Dickens in the 19th century, the serialization of novels. People want to see the same type of Dickens things. I've often wondered if Dickens had come along, say, 50, 60, 70 years later, around 1890 to 1910, serialized novels were going the way of the dinosaur back then. And he might have been forced to change the way he approached novels, because if you look at Dickens's novels, you can see, if you were to graph them, you could see sort of a flow chart of the drama. You can see the same types of characters, the weird names, the heroes, especially if they're young boys, are always plucky. The women, generally speaking, are menacing in some way. The real bad guys are these very Victorian pimps and abusers and whatnot. Society is against the poor. And as far as the structure of this book, all 4 of the books in the quartet was based on 4. So they had 64 chapters, which is 4 times 4 times 4 and 4 times 4 books. Here, each of the 3 books of the Heroic Trilogy is 27 chapters, or 3 times 3 times 3. And so I broke this up into Alpha, Omega, and Infinity. I was generally trying to do the structure of 2001: A Space Odyssey, with Infinity being sort of where the book takes off in the final direction, sort of like going through the portal. I used the Stevens titles. I got that idea actually from myself, because I actually conceived of a book that I haven't written yet that I'm going to call The Grand and the Glorious, which will be the final saga in the Maravelli family, the destruction of the Maravelli family in around 2020. And I'm going to have that book, all of the titles are going to be from the titles of film noir. So films noir are going to be the titles there. But I was saying that's interesting too, but it helped me structure things. So when I have titles, for example, like Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour, there's certainly going to be a woman in there. When I have the Sketch of the Ultimate Politician, I think that's a Nixon chapter. When I have something like The Planet on the Table, I think that's the chapter where Nixon tries to nuke Russia. And so by looking at the Stevens titles and picking out the 30 or 40 most interesting titles and thinking about what I wanted to do, I sometimes got ideas for the narrative from the very titles. I might have had, out of the 27 chapters, 15, 16, 17, 18 chapters that I knew were going to be in there, but I still left, 10 or so chapters where I had to add things in. One of the chapters is called 6 Significant Landscapes, and this chapter has a series of 6 little blackout sketches of the hero with women in the spy game that he was involved with. So the titles informed the structure of the story, at least some of the details, if not the overall architecture.
He is one of the best characters in your canon.
Who?
Because he's Elias Walker.
Oh.
This Elias Walker, as you said.
He's my favorite of the three Elias Walkers.
He's one of the deeper characters, too, in the sense that he's a very unreliable narrator. Right?
Yes.
He has sections where he'll speak about the James Bond stereotype in betting women, and then 200 pages later he'll be mentioning how no such stereotype exists. So you begin questioning everything that he's telling you. And there's a reference to Elmir Dahori towards the end of the book. You wonder if he's similar in the spy sense, whether he really is a spy, what he really knows, and what is made up and what is not.
Well, one of the things in this book that's similar, Jessica had originally called this book sort of a condensed version of A Norwegian the Family. And it's not really, but to a certain degree there are some elements, like I do use real-life people like Elmir Dahori. I use Bert Convey, a game show host, this innocuous, great-looking guy that housewives, oohed and awed over from the 60s to the 80s. I have him as a psychopathic agent who mentored the Elias Walker. And there's one really funny scene with him where he's talking about kill counts, and he's listing off percentage of people killed and how he wants to get past, the all-time guy who's from the CIA in his fictional organization called the Department of American Security, how he wants to be
the bastards laid him off.
Yeah. And so
he couldn't get past his required kill count.
Yeah, and so there are lots of things like that. I take people. There's a guy who is an accordionist that I saw on a game show, an old game show from the Game Show Network I watched here in Texas called Buzzer, and this guy was a world champion accordionist. So I figured he'd be interesting if he was a spy or whatnot. And so you have all of these little hints of reality about it. But then there are also some chilling moments. Bert Convey, for example, we see gets involved in the genocide in Indonesia in the 1970s. And there's this one scene where he's chasing after one of the enemies of the United States, and he kills the guy, shoots him, and the guy falls in a cave. And Bert Convey's there. I think he wants to smoke a cigarette over his kill. And then all of a sudden, all of these crabs start coming in, and these little fiddler crabs start coming in, and they start ripping apart the dead body, and Bert Convey gets the hell out of there. And it's just one of those creepy kind of moments that is very mindful, is very impactful, I think, in the book. Bit von Rheingold makes an appearance with a character who made his first appearance in A Norwegian in the Family called Michael. He was a writer who did Sex Life of the Gods. Michael Nur made a brief appearance, is barely mentioned in A Norwegian in the Family. In 1964, he has a few scenes with Bit von Rheingold. By the time this book comes out, he's sort of Bit von Rheingold's manservant or whatnot. He is to Bit von Rheingold what Bit was to Big Frank in A Norwegian in the Family, and there's a few comic scenes they have there. But do you
recall the salon scene? He's
what?
Part of the salon scene. That scene
where
Elias Walker goes and meets his friend Aldo.
Right, which is based totally on, which is again what I've done, like with the Vincetti brothers. I took it from Rocco and his brothers. That salon guy is based upon La Dolce Vita there, but I expanded that.
I was going to mention that later, the La Dolce Vita connection and how kind of inferred what a reader expected from that. But the salon scene itself, that's probably one of the best examples of your writing. It goes from, going to the salon where other characters are talking, like it reminded me of kind of Orson Welles' films, where they're talking, you'll get bits of conversation out of them, and then he'll interact with someone else, and they'll reveal another part of his character. They'll go and bed someone while they're looking at snapshots of their vacation. Then he'll go off and talk to Aldo, and they have this deeper bonding moment between them two. And that's one of those examples too that really showcases Elias Walker's character and what a fraud he is. Because even as he denied admiring Aldo, he clearly had some admiration before this revealing of himself to the audience as the fraud that he is.
Well, another thing, there's a really great episode of The X-Files about the character called Cigarette Smoking Man. I don't know if you ever saw that show. Did you ever see X-Files?
I've seen the X-Files, yes.
You know, there's the cigarette smoking man, and there's one episode where we find out that the cigarette smoking man in the X-Files mythos was probably the guy who killed John F. Kennedy, and yet throughout that hour-long show, we find out over a 35-year period that the cigarette smoking man in his downtime has been writing these potboiler spy mysteries, and he's a bad writer, but finally someone wants to get his work published, and by the end of the episode, for some reason, he can't get it published because he can't get the clearance or something to get it published, and so his life's dream of being a published author goes up in smoke. And it's interesting because this sinister figure, who's been at that time 5 or 6 years in the mythos of that show, is revealed to be this weak little man who has this moment of joy when he gets an acceptance letter that they want to publish his book, and then it crumbles to him. Well, in a similar way, I wanted to have Elias Walker be sort of like the cigarette-smoking man in the presence of this great guy. We only see Aldo, I think it's Aldo Vasari,
Yes.
yeah, which is based upon Giorgio Vasari, Lives of the Artist. But so it totally mirrors the 3 times that the salon keeper from La Dolce Vita. They first meet in a church, and I think that he's playing the organ, which I also used, I think, a bit from Carnival of Souls, the film. Then the second time is the salon sequence, and the third time we find out that the guy has killed himself and his wife. In the film, he kills himself and the kids, but I thought it would be better if he kills himself and his wife in this version. But the Spy Elias Walker 2, the book is much different than I initially envisioned it. Initially, I was going to have the book be about 50% about his spy life versus 50% of his personal life. And that personal life was going to be dominated by his love affair with this woman who was much younger. I was going to have flashbacks to his various affairs with women over the years, but by the time of the late 90s or early O's, around 9/11, I was going to have him be involved with a 3-decade or younger babe who I based upon the girlfriend of an ex-girlfriend of Alex Sheremid, who was this exotic, foreign. She's from Guyana or whatnot, and so I thought, because in my mind, this Elias Walker looks sort of like Harrison Ford did in his late 50s, early 60s. I have a very Harrison Ford-like look. So I said, let me do a book where there's an exotic Bond babe, but she's not these Bond bimbos. She's the love of his life, and she's just an average girl who's pretty and much younger, who wants to get married to him and loves him for who he is. But as the book went along, it just didn't interest me. Just like I dropped the Michael Faraday into The Scorpion Swam, it just wasn't important. So the girl, Lal, L-A-L, is her nickname. Lal only appears in 3 scenes in the book, just like the Guru. In both scenes,
the third scene is a very devastating and effective ending.
Yeah. Well, because we don't know why she, for some reason, gets the gumption to leave him. We think in the book that he's going to get the happy ending. We know the book opens in 2015, I think it is, when I wrote the book. I started the book in 2015. He's pushing 80, and he's driving here in Texas, in the Austin area where I live, to meet someone. We don't know what's going on. He accidentally kills a cat, and just like in Proust, Remembrance of Things Past, just as eating the Madeleine becomes the reason that Proust, or the Proust character, remembers his whole life in that whole book, this whole book opens up because of the accidental killing and running over this cat, which is something that I actually did back then when I was coming home from a job I was working then. I accidentally killed a cat, and I felt so badly about it. I don't know if, the cat I scrambled away, but it got hit, and it probably died at the side of the road. And I figured that this guy who had a life full of death and killing and violence in his life, that at the age of 80, that might be the trigger. So by the end of the book, we think he's about ready to settle down, and she decides that she's going to be a nurse. She gets some scholarship to upstate New York to go to a nursing school. She leaves him, and from that point at the end of the book to the beginning of the book is about 15 years. We figure, he's just lived a very lonely life because it's post 9/11. He's probably been sucked back in, like Al Pacino says in Godfather 3. He's sucked back into his spy life. He's probably unhappy and unfulfilled, like the cigarette smoking man, and and by the end of that book, that's why he has this sort of reverie where the book ends with him trying to flag down a bus, and he sees someone. He's thinking about Elmia Dahori, and he sees a woman. And I again go back to La Dolce Vita. There's a very ambiguous ending to the book.
The one thing I wanted to mention, and viewers can see just by how you're speaking about this book, you're very elusive both in person and in literature, mentioning many different ideas. And I think in your book, sort of like finding the most essential moments of each character, honing in on those moments, and especially in their higher moments where they're talking about things outside of themselves and showing their own limitations in doing so. But one thing I wanted to mention is, you mentioned this law, and anyone who knows you or that has that connection in some way knows exactly who that character is based off, just based on the name. It's very similar sounding. But you also have a handful of other characters, too, that have that same effect. There's one that's very humorous, homosexual transcendentalist. He has a very similar name to someone else that we all know. Talk about that process, using illusions, using higher ideas with characters.
Well, it's been. I haven't read the book really since I've done. You don't have to name the real person, but what's the transcendental homosexual that you mentioned?
Yeah, he's this bumbling buffoon who was once a good poet, but since he fell out with this Queen's ran a poetry group, he's sort of lost his mind.
Yeah,
the Salon too, it has some of the most touching moments in it, but it also has some of the funniest, with the Susan Sontag character kind of being bitchy in the background. One of my favorite sections, and it's just in passing, is when Aldo and Elias Walker are having a conversation, kind of revealing their own faults in each other. Susan Sontag is in the background, and Aldo admits that he doesn't have any more insight than a beetle. And Susan Sontag uses an allusion to Ringo, and Elias Walker, in the process, he's being interrupted by this thought that Susan Sontag indeed has depth, while he's trying to engage with Aldo in his worst moments.
Well,
it has that realism in the terms of being interrupted by other characters as they're having more intense and deeper discussions.
Yeah, but it should be stated, too, I mentioned how the first Elias Walker in the Western, in a sense, as the old saying goes, he stepped in shit at some point, i.e. that he seems to get by with luck in life. This Elias Walker, professionally, in a sense, can almost do no wrong. One of my favorite passages is where he takes on someone who is a real super criminal, this Russian killer called Super Killer, which is a real guy back in the 80s and 90s. And his death has always been clouded in mystery. He was killed sometime in Greece in the late 90s. And we don't know if it was Putin and his organization. We don't know if it was the CIA or whatnot. But in my book, I have my super spy Elias Walker, by then a man in his early 60s, basically kills this super guy and does it rather easily. Things just seem to fall into place for him. Totally opposite from his personal life. He's the frustrated cigarette smoking man in his personal life, but he's still the super spy Elias Walker. He's still the James Bond. And so you have this idea. One of the criticisms of the James Bond novels, and also more recently the James Bond films, is that we never see the real James Bond, and the Daniel Craig films are just glorified trailers. That I saw the first 45 after I did the James Bond show. I actually saw that next day. I saw the first 45 minutes of Quantum of Solace, and it's horrendous. I just couldn't take it anymore. But we have this character who's a dichotomy, which is fitting since he's called the anti-hero. And an anti-hero is not the bad guy as hero, like that show Dexter that has a serial killer as a hero. That's not an anti-hero. That's not the definition of an anti-hero. An anti-hero is someone who is on the edge. We don't know if he's good or bad. He does some things good, some things bad. That Dexter, as a serial killer, is a bad guy. He's what's known in the TV tropes land as a likable bad guy, but that's not an anti-hero. This Elias Walker is an anti-hero. I think Bert Convy, who says he's now the top killer in U.S. spy history, sort of mocks Elias Walker because Walker's only killed like 800 people versus his 1,400 or something like that. And yet, by the same token, we see a lot of violence in the life of Elias Walker, and we don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. We see some of the things he does. For example, there's one of the scenes in, I think it's in the chapter, The Six Significant Landscapes, where he kills a woman who he thinks is the woman he's been sent after, but at the end, the blackout scene ends with the woman that he's supposed to kill walking in, so he's killed an innocent woman at some point. So we know that at least once in his life, and probably more, he has killed innocent people. And he's walking around and probably collecting a pension even as he's lonely as the love of his life, or the supposed love of his life, this Lal has left him to be lonely for his declining years. We know that this is a guy that, while he's not Big Frank Conchetto, while he's not the Norwegian or the mule, that the circumstances have sometimes left him to do some bad things. We know, for example, he's involved in what I call the Swedish sleep experiment, which is based upon the urban legend of the Russian sleep experiment. Except here I tie it into a real-life assassination of the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme, back in the 1980s, which is another way, is just like with the Norwegian, I constantly am tying in historical events to my timeline, and they usually fit quite well and perfectly. But we know, for example,
because they're so ambiguous, that they fit well together. Yeah. There's an example too of there's two examples. First is a humorous interaction that Nixon has with Henry Kissinger that they get on tape and are listening to it, where Nixon keeps on going back and forth, trying to admit to Henry Kissinger that he can't get it up for Buddy, his wife. Yeah. And that leads into a later scene where Prescott Bush decides to initiate a plan in which Elias Walker needs to assassinate Nixon and Kissinger because they're about to nuke Russia.
Yeah. Which is actually based upon, in 1969, just like in Dr. Strangelove, there were I forget if it was, I think it was planes that were sent over the Arctic, they were heading towards the North Pole and whatnot, and there was literally about 20 or 30 minutes that if they hadn't called back those planes, the Russians would have scrambled and set off bombs heading towards us, ICBMs, and it could have been the end of the world. So how do we deal with that? I deal with that by making it a part of the scene and having Nixon and Kissinger grovel. And that's the most important scene in the book as it relates to the title of the book, because the idea of the Super 7 is a subset of the Department of American Security that was introduced in A Norwegian in the Family. And we're told that the Super 7 are 7 people who sit on a council that basically decide. It's sort of like the American Illuminati, or if you're into UFO lore, the Majestic 12, that Prescott Bush, the head of the DAS, Elias Walker, and a few other people, and I mentioned some real-life people who are diplomats and whatnot in real life. All of those are real names who sat at one point on the Super 7. That's the only time that we get a hint of why the book is called the Super Seven, because we don't see any of these other people in action. We just hear about them, or former generals and whatnot. But in this scene, we see that the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, uh, that legally they can be assassinated if they don't, if Nixon doesn't recall the things, which gives the power that behind everything there's this looming power. Just like in a Norwegian in the Family, I have the thing what I call the higher powers. People like Carlo Gambino and Howard Hughes and Prescott Bush. That there are people bigger than the mafia. And bigger than the president is this looming power, which is playing off this American paranoia, which goes back to the bankers and the Freemasons and the Illuminati and the Rothschilds and the aliens, from Beetlejuice or whatever the hell.
Prescott Bush is a good choice to mine from too, since he has had hardly any information written about him as opposed to his son George Herbert Walker Bush and then his grandson George W. Bush.
And that's why I chose him too. And by choosing him,
did you in creating the character, did you have any? Does this Prescott Bush have any association with the real Prescott Bush, or is it completely fictive in your creation?
Well, his outer bio, the jobs he held, is true. He holds the job. He's appointed. In a Norwegian in the Family, he's appointed by John F. Kennedy the year after he stepped down from the Senate, and he holds it until his death in '73. I think in a Norwegian in the Family, there's a phone call between him and J. Edgar Hoover, where they're basically blackmailing each other or threatening each other. And so, that fits the timeline. In real life, Prescott Bush served on corporate boards and the usual bullshit. But, in my world, a Prescott Bush who had two of his descendants become president, he's driving and he wants to be the power behind the throne. So it makes sense for him to be the head of this fictional department, intelligence department, since George Herbert Walker Bush was at one point the head of the CIA. So it kind of makes sense in that way. But the whole book really does, getting back to the anti-hero thing, which I was mentioning, is that this Elias Walker is a good man in certain sense, but he's someone who has made a compromise, and he's never going to be able to be what he could have been at some point. He's not as gung-ho and over the top as the Bert Convy character is. We see that he has lots of connections. There's a character they call the Inspector that he meets when Bit von Rheingold and the other guy, Michael Nur, are pulled in for some reason in Idaho, and they're taken to some underground facility underneath the county jail or something in Idaho. And then there are all other sorts of scenes, little scenes here and there that come and go with the spies and whatnot. And so I think it has total immersive moments, but it's much compressed. I mentioned the accordion guy. In a sense, this is like me compressing. If you were to say that a Norwegian in the Family of Vincetti Brothers flowed more naturally, this one is deliberately compressed. I get so much information into just under 300,000 words. It's like 292,000 words. It feels like a book probably that's 1 million words, but it's only a little under 300,000.
I wanted to mention too, the Elias Walker is in a sense sort of a grim reaper too, in that no matter what scene he's in, it seems like death intrudes into it.
Yeah.
There's one scene with Lau where he goes and is talking about her curves and how beautiful she is, the things that he finds very sexual about her, and then death just intrudes there when he goes and kills this abusive boyfriend of hers in the middle of this very sensual love scene that they're having, and it catches the reader off guard in that sense.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned in an earlier video that I rewatched a week or so ago. I took that biographical element from the real life woman that the character is based on, and initially when I wrote the two scenes about the abusive family member of hers that eventually gets killed, not in real life but in the book, I had given the character two different names, and I changed it to one because I wanted to show I earlier had shown the unreliability of Elias Walker as a narrator, whereas if I hadn't changed it, it would been too big of a schism. Maybe he's not senile, but you know, there is there's a lot there, and there's some moments. I think in this book, I have the moment where he's walking along the tracks and he sees an old man hobbling along with a young boy, and he just sort of eyes them, and then a few minutes later, 5 minutes, a quarter of a mile later, he sees a bear, and he readies his gun to kill the bear if it comes at him, and then the bear moves on, and so there are these little poetic moments. I always have these moments. The job I'm working now, sometimes I'll go out at night, like yesterday. I was waxing some floors, and I waxed about 19 areas, hallways and rooms and whatnot. And so you have to wait about 20 minutes between waxings. So you go to different rooms, but if the wax isn't dry, you have to wait a little bit. So I was waiting outside, and I was looking up. It's probably 10:30 at night, and I'm looking up at the moon behind the clouds and whatnot. And some nights over the last few months, I've seen the stars out there. And I sometimes envy you up in northern British Columbia, because you must have very crystal clear nights up there. You could probably see.
You would be wrong.
Yeah.
In any city that's covered with as much smog as any other city.
Yeah, but you've only got what 10.
Yes, the stars are very visible, and you can see Venus peaking. But outside of that, in any city, you're going to get tons of smog.